Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Artilles. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore and our partner bookstore, Politics and Prose in Washington, D.C., I'm thrilled to introduce this virtual event with Kazuo Ishiguro discussing his highly anticipated new novel, Klara and the Sun, in conversation with Kate Darling. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us. Through virtual programming like tonight's, indie bookstores across the country continue to bring authors and their work to our local communities and our new digital communities. Learn more at harvard.com and politics-prose.com, where you can check out our upcoming event calendars and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. So if you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In just a moment, I'll post the bookstore links to purchase additional copies of Klara and the Sun in the chat. Your book and ticket purchases make virtual author events like this possible, and now more than ever, support the future of great independent bookstores. So thank you for tuning in. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, if we encounter any tech issues during the event tonight, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. So thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm honored to introduce tonight's speakers. Kazuo Ishiguro's 8 previous works of fiction have earned him many honors around the world, including the Nobel Prize in Literature and the Booker Prize. His work has been translated into over 50 languages, and The Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go, both made into acclaimed films, have each sold more than 2 million copies. He was given a knighthood in 2018 for services to literature. He also holds the decorations of Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres from France and the Order of the Rising Sun Gold and Silver Star from Japan. Joining him tonight on our digital stage is Dr. Kate Darling, a leading expert in robot ethics. She's a researcher at the MIT Media Lab, where she explores the emotional connection between people and lifelike machines, seeking to influence technology design and policy direction. Her work has been featured in Vogue, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Guardian, the BBC, Wired, and more, and she is the caretaker for several domestic robots, including her Plios Yochai Peter and Mr. Spaghetti. Tonight, they'll be discussing Kazuo's new novel, Klara and the Sun, in which we follow the titular Klara, an artificial friend, as she becomes acclimated to her role as a companion for a teenage girl. Although her understanding of the human world is limited by her programming, she, like her fictional brethren in Ishiguro's previous novels, attempts to make meaning of her life and the lives around her within their various physical and societal constraints. James Wood praises Ishiguro's use of his inhuman, all too human narrators to gaze upon the theological heft of our lives and to call its bluff. And Charles Finch says in the LA Times, "Few writers who have ever lived have ever been able to create moods of transience, loss, and existential self-doubt as Ishiguro has. Not art about the feelings, but the feelings themselves." Now, it is my pleasure to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Kazuo and Kate.
Hi. Hello.
Hi, hi.
Hi, and hello to everybody out there. It's odd that we can't see you, but hello, Kate. It's evening over here, but I guess it's, what is it, daytime over there still?
It's evening here too, just not quite as late. And yeah, when Politics and Prose and Harvard Bookstore reached out and asked me if I was interested in doing this event, it's not like I had anything else planned tonight. We're all still home, but I was still very, very excited. I mean, it's not every day that one gets a chance to read an advanced copy of Kazuo Ishiguro's new novel. We actually had this pre-event call, you and I, and you said, "Oh, don't feel like you actually need to read the book." Ish, of course I read the book.
Well, yeah, I meant, yeah, I guess it's helpful if you read the book, but I tell you, I've done a surprising number of interviews with people who haven't read the book.
Are you kidding me? That's just, I mean, and also like, it's such a good book. I mean, even if you have, like, I actually think you should consider telling people to read it instead of telling them they don't have to, because I really love this book. It's the exact genre of fiction that I am a total sucker for, which is this near-term future science fiction that's not so much about the technology or the setting itself as it is about, society and people and the human condition. And Klara just does such a good job of that. So I hope that everyone at this event reads the book, and we'll try not to spoil anything, because I also think it's very beautiful how the story unfolds in the book. But I did want to start off with a very general question, which is, what was going through your mind at the time that you wrote this story? What themes or questions were you grappling with that made you want to write this?
Well, this thing started as a children's story, and I mean like a story for very young children, like for 5-year-olds, or you have a young child, these picture books, and I find that the world of those picture books very enchanting, but also quite poignant. And so I've always been fascinated by those books, the illustrations as much as anything else, and the little slim story. And so I had this very short little story for children that I thought could actually be a collaboration with a really interesting artist, to produce what I thought was a sweetly poignant story. But then I ran this past my daughter, Naomi Ishiguro, who is also an author, and at that point she was working in a bookstore, and she knew all about young children's books, and she stared at me and said, "No, there is no way you can go anywhere near a young child with that story. That is you'll traumatize young children with that story." So I thought, oh, okay, maybe it's an adult story, and so it turned into this novel. And it took on these dystopian aspects. The world it's set in has a lot of these things you just mentioned, because I've been thinking a lot about how the world was changing because of AI, because of the field that you're very interested in, robotics, big data, and also gene editing, and so it became like a story for very young children that had become, it got very dark. It was about so it's about a little robot girl who tries to save a human family from heartbreak. So that's kind of how it all came together.
And your daughter didn't tell you that the children's book has already been written? It's called Corduroy.
Oh, really? Well, I'll inform her. I'll inform her of that. What happened?
No, I'm just joking. But Corduroy is a story about a bear that's waiting in the shop for someone to come pick it up, and that's how your novel starts as well. So I immediately thought of the children's story.
Well, I think is that the name of the bear, Corduroy?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and he's
Wait, you don't know this book? Is this not a thing in Britain?
No, it isn't.
Huh.
No, it isn't. But I'm sure we have books about toys waiting to be bought and stuff like that. I mean, so yeah, I wanted to start Klara in that classic mode, I suppose, of the toy in the toy shop waiting to be bought. Except she's a kind of super intelligent toy, and she starts to observe the world outside of the shop window, and she can learn at an exponential rate, and because she's been created to stop teenagers from becoming lonely, she sees everything through the lens of loneliness. She looks out into the street and says, I wonder if those people are walking like that because they're trying to avoid getting lonely. Or she sees everything, the taxis and everything in terms of loneliness. And so yeah, it's I guess it's probably like your Corduroy. I must look this book up, but it's different. I bet you Corduroy doesn't have these kinds of obsessions or these lenses when he's looking out of the store window.
No, and I actually wanted to ask you about the loneliness theme in this, because reading this during the pandemic was particularly, like, it just seems like very impeccable timing for this novel, because things hit home in a way that I'm not sure they would have at a different time. The whole loneliness topic, but also the mediating loneliness through technology, which for the past year, journalists have been asking me, should we be using technology or robots to help with this pandemic, to help people feel less lonely? And I actually got my parents a robot cat as a joke. It's like a poor quality product. Like it's clear that they didn't even bother to like record a cat meowing. They just gave an intern a microphone and said, say meow into this microphone for the sound effects. And I sent this to them sort of as a joke, but they really love the cat. And I'm curious, is that, to you personally, does that feel like a dystopia or like something that's useful?
I find that whole phenomenon really interesting, and it does. I think what you just said there, kind of, it does touch on some of the inner core themes of this book. So no need to go into the details of why it does. I mean, let me just say it does. But that's very interesting. I mean, it reminded me of those toys Furbies. I think that when I met you recently by Zoom, we discussed Furbies, because I think I saw a photograph of you with a Furby behind you on your website or something like this. And I remembered that when my daughter was younger, she loved these Furby things, which I guess people in America are familiar. They are Americans. Sorry, they're not American citizens, but they are American toys, yes? And they have a kind of a very basic AI kind of thing. They talk to each other and make noises. But the Furby company also seemed to make just Furbies that were just soft toys without this kind of voice and sort of intelligence element. And what was interesting was that for my daughter, there really wasn't much of a difference. She liked the non-intelligent, the traditional stuffed toy Furbies in some ways, perhaps more. And I thought that was quite interesting, that it obviously the fact that this attempt to give the Furby a kind of an individual soul or something was perhaps not actually necessary. At least it wasn't for my daughter. And I have to say, it wasn't for me either. I quite like the ones that you could do their voices, as opposed to having to listen to them all the time.
Well, that might also be the design of the Furby, which is kind of like a creature from hell. I'm not sure that everyone is a fan of the Furby, but I also tell the part of the story where the Furby broke.
Oh, yes. Well, that's what I was telling you last time. I mean, that was quite interesting, because the black Furby, I mean, she had 3 Furbies, and the one that was called Delola, because the creature's called Delola because it says, I am Delola or something like this. And it did, Delola broke, and it did feel like a traumatic event in the family. I mean, I have to tell you, my daughter was only about 6 or something. This isn't when she was 18. I mean, right? She's 6. Okay. And we sent Delola to the local kind of place for fixing Furbies. There was a little letter that came with her, and of course, what we were terrified about was that they would fix her, but Delola would come back with a different name. She'll say, I am Toto or something, and this will completely absolutely freak not just our daughter out, but it will freak us out. So we wrote in big capital letters, when you fix this Furby, please make sure that she is still called Delola. And very kindly, that's what they did, and so it worked out fine. Delola's still in the house somewhere, I think.
Oh, really?
Although without batteries.
I love that, because that happens a lot. It's not just you. I mean, people will do that with their robot vacuum cleaners, where they'll insist on getting the same one back and not a different one. There was this profile of you in I think this was from the New York Magazine profile that just came out, but you said that if it starts to look like we can be reduced to the point where we're just a bunch of algorithms, I think that seriously erodes the idea that each person is unique and therefore worthy of respect and care, regardless of what they can or can't contribute to our joint enterprise. And I think the thing that I love the most about this book, there were a lot of things, but the thing I love most was that there's so much science fiction that uses robots or machines or artificial people to think about what it means to be human. And the question is, often, what's the difference between humans and these artificial creatures? And the answer is usually either, well, humans have a soul, or some other equivalent thing that's not defined, that we can't really define, that's a stand-in for a soul, or that there is no relevant difference. And Klara provides a really different answer, and maybe even a slightly different question, which is what makes an individual special and unique. Would it be a spoiler to say what the answer is?
What you want me to say it, or are you going to say?
Well, just is it okay if we talk about it?
Yeah, no, okay, yeah, okay. I mean, I think that's fine, but I mean, I'll just say that I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, this is what the novel poses as a question, but it doesn't pose it quite in that abstract way. It's a story, it's a family drama. So I mean, what it boils down to is that the mother is terrified that her teenage daughter will die of this illness that she has, and faced with the prospect of grief and bereavement, because she lives in a world where robotics, artificial intelligence, big data, algorithms seem to almost offer to be able to map out a person. She's tempted by the idea that she could actually make it through this loss by actually, maybe you can actually kind of replace an individual. Maybe individuals are not so unique as we think, that in the way that we have thought for centuries. Maybe now we have the know-how to find out enough about a person so that you can more or less keep their data and carry them on in some other way. I mean, it's not so much that she literally thinks this can be done, but somehow her idea of the uniqueness of people, call it the soul, if you like, the idea that each of us has a special soul. And it's by virtue of that soul, it makes sense to say that you love this particular person and you don't love this other person. And if you lose the person you love, that person is just gone forever, irreplaceable. I guess she starts to wonder if you can challenge that idea. Her perception starts to slightly waver, and she asks herself, could I actually make myself believe that my daughter has been preserved because these machines, what we have now, can more or less actually preserve everything that makes her special and unique. Maybe she's transferable in some kind of way. And even opening that little idea up even a tiny bit, that possibility, maybe that changes something profoundly in the way we look at each other, even within the family. So I guess that's the question that the book poses, and that's the question that Klara asks, because she's this naive outsider who's come into this family as a kind of a toy or a servant or a governess or something, and that becomes the question that really fascinates her, and she realizes that she's actually intimately involved in the kind of plot that that's being hatched within the family. And yeah, as you say, yeah, okay, maybe there is a kind of an answer that Klara finds at the end. But I'm not suggesting that's a definitive answer. It's just something that the character says to herself. That
oh, come on, it's a beautiful answer.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm slightly hesitating, not because I think it's a spoiler, but because people think this is some sort of message that I personally have. It's just what my character says or thinks after observing human beings for the span of her short existence. But basically, she thinks, well, all these people are debating about whether there is a soul inside these bodies that makes each person unique. But she thinks, well, maybe there is something. but they were looking in the wrong place. What makes somebody unique and irreplaceable are the feelings that the people around a person have towards that person. And I suppose Klara thinks, yeah, it's to do with the love that people have for this teenage girl that makes the teenage girl completely unique. And they were looking in the wrong place. You may not find anything inside her, but her uniqueness is real, because the emotions and the love that of the few people who love her, that's real, and that is unique. But that's just the thought that she has.
Well, I mean,
I'm not even sure it's correct.
Well, yeah, I mean, but whether or not it's, a definitive answer, it's a different answer than the one that I most commonly see in stories that, take up these topics. And I loved it. I actually took it a little further in my mind, because, for me personally, I immediately started thinking, oh, does this idea that what makes us special is the feelings that others have for her, that who love us, does that only apply to humans? Could that apply to, dogs, robots, your daughter's Furby? If people love it, does that make it special and unique? Does it apply to any individual? And what I like about that is it doesn't pit humans and robots against each other like in all the other science fiction, but is rather a question about what makes anyone special. So do you think it applies to the Furbies?
Well, yeah, this is what worries me. This is why I was so careful to say this isn't my philosophy. This isn't what I'm offering to the world. Because I can see all kinds of dangers about what Klara says at the end. And I think, I think a lot of the things that you've been researching and writing about, I think points to this. I mean, if you start to say there isn't anything particularly intrinsically unique about each individual, it's something to do with what people project onto that person that makes that person special. Well, you can see that there are some big dangers about that immediately, because we can project all kinds of things. We can project negative things. I mean, we can be savagely prejudiced towards a person. Once we let go of this idea that we have nurtured, not for very long, but certainly since the end of the Second World War, that we have nurtured in what we roughly call the liberal democratic free world, is the idea that each person, regardless of whether they're rich or poor, or whether they contribute or they don't contribute to the economy, there is something absolutely sacrosanct about each individual person. And so you start with that as the unit when you're actually building a society. You don't have an idea or a cause and say that, and all these individuals serve the cause. And if it's convenient, you can sacrifice some of them. You can't do that, because the very basic unit of value that you build on is the individual. And I think we have that idea very strongly. Although I have to say it's not an ancient idea. It's quite a fragile idea. I mean, it might seem like a very firmly lodged idea for us at the moment, but I think it's a fragile idea. And in other parts of the world right now, people don't necessarily think like that. And certainly in the past, in all our countries, in your country and mine, we didn't think like that towards all kinds of people. So it's a very fragile idea, and we're kind of holding on to it. And I think the presence and the encroaching presence, you could say, of big data, artificial intelligence, it might actually start to challenge this idea that we have about the uniqueness and the unique value of each individual person. So I'm slightly I'm worried by that idea of Klara's. I mean, it's beautiful in a way that, we're all unique because of the love that people feel, but I mean, of course you can turn that around, to all kinds of emotions. But this is why I'm kind of interested. I'm genuinely interested. I'm not just being polite because you're interviewing me here today, and it's some sort of etiquette. I'm deeply interested, and my novel is deeply interested in the kind of thinking that you've been doing. I mean, I came across a guy called Will Knight just recently. He was interviewing me for Wired magazine, and he said he knew you because you had made him take part in this traumatic experiment.
He volunteered.
He volunteered. Well, he still seemed rather shaken up by it. He said, I see you're going to talk, you're going to have an event with Dr. Kate Darling. Well, you know, I tell you, I'm not going to forget that in a hurry. And he was one of the people you asked to what, torture or smash up one of these cute little what do you call it? Pleos? Is that what they're called? These kind of they're basically like artificial intelligence lizards. Is that what they are? I mean, they look very sweet, but they seem to they behave to a large extent like a sweet creature. You seem to have their own mind, and you've been conducting various experiments about whether people can bring themselves to hurt them and damage them, and I find that really fascinating because it goes to this very thing that we've just been talking about, and if you like, one of the ideas anyway that's presented in my novel is that, you know, it's something to do with the feelings that we project onto things that make them special, and that effectively gives them a soul. Never mind what's inside, and that does really, I find it kind of disturbing and really fascinating, the experiments you've been conducting, and I would wonder, you know, when people like Will and other people like that found it very difficult to take a hammer or an axe to one of these sweet little creatures and mutilate them. I mean, were they actually being irrational? I'm not quite sure what you concluded. Are you saying they're being irrational because they know that these are not living creatures, or are you saying they're being very sentimental? Or, I mean, you know, I would kind of like to know now that I have you here.
Well, thank you. Well, okay, so just to kind of summarize, this is some work that I did years ago. I did a workshop with the Pleos, which, fun fact, designed by the same person as the Furby, but a much more compelling robot, mimics pain very well. And you know, I did a workshop with my friend Hannes Gosselt where we had people torture and kill the robots, and that was not an experiment. That was not science. But it later led to some work at MIT that I did with my colleague Palash Nanbi, and that's the one that Will Knight took part in voluntarily. Ethics review board, please don't come after me. And Will Knight and others came into the lab and they smashed hex bugs with mallets, which they're a little simple toy that just moves around like an insect. And so we took something that was much less cute, much less evocative for the experiment. And the thing we were interested in at the time was, we had people, you know, hit them with mallets, and separately we did a psychological empathy test with them to see where they scored on different measures of empathy. And, you know, we found that people who scored high on empathy, in particular, emotional empathy for other people, they hesitated much more to hit the hex bugs. And they hesitated, especially if we gave the hex bug a name, for example. So, I mean, it was, you know, one little experiment, you know, you can't draw too much from it. But I think one of the things that I've always been interested in is, we were just talking about this relational approach. So this idea that Klara has, that, you know, what matters is how we relate to something and our relationship to it, rather than what's intrinsically special. And that just is very apparent when it comes to how people are starting to interact with robots, that we don't actually care about what's inside of them. We mostly care about, you know, which ones we relate to, which ones seem cute to us, which ones move in a way that like appeals to us biologically. And that makes us empathize with them. Now, the question of, you know, is this a good or a bad thing? Is this something we should be worried about? Well, I agree with you that this can go in some disturbing directions as well. But I do think that it is really interesting that robots are holding up this mirror to ourselves and saying, hey, look, you really, really care about this relational stuff. In fact, look at the history of animal rights in the Western world, at least, and think about, whether you even treat animals in the, ethical way that you think you should. Or is it that we just, like the animals that are cute to us or mean something to us culturally and disregard the other animals? So, while I do think that Klara's answer is really beautiful and profound, and that we need to give it attention because it is part of our nature, I don't think the relational approach is enough. And in fact, I think we should be aware of it so that we can nudge ourselves, guide society in perhaps a more conscious direction. Go ahead.
If I can just interrupt, Kate. I mean, there's a few thoughts I had while you're saying that. I mean, you compared you made a very, I think, a very interesting and I think very valid comparison between people who are thinking about the ethics of how they treat or mistreat a little robot toy with the way we perhaps mistreat animals. But of course, I mean, why look at our relationship with animals? I mean, we have done this to fellow human beings over and over and over again throughout history. We have created castes or whatever, and convinced ourselves that they are, by whatever terminology you want to use, so that they don't have the right kinds of souls, or perhaps they don't have souls at all. And so you either kind of you exploit them as slaves, or you exterminate them in gas chambers. I mean, whatever. I mean, we never seem to quite be free of this at any given point in the world, in time in the world. Somewhere, somebody is doing this. It's not some kind of solo axe murderer. I mean, we seem to have situations where large numbers of ordinary people can accept that a group of people are sufficiently different that you can do this. So I mean, so that kind of worries me, that the Klara's answer that it's all to do with the if your validity rests on how other people feel towards you, and your uniqueness rests on how other people feel towards you, what do you do when the people around you can be persuaded to not value you? Think that you're just something that can be exploited, or something that should be eliminated. I mean, but so that's one thought I had. The other thought I had was, and it's quite a different one. I mean, I can see the parallels with what I do for my work. You're talking about people behaving and getting quite emotional and worked up about these creatures, these artificial creatures. I make artificial creatures all the time. I mean, that's what I do. I just make them up in words. And I mean, a lot of the things you've been saying, I observe happening when people read my books, and other people's books. They get very worked up and very emotional, very attached to some characters. They start weeping or something, or they get very angry, or because of the fate of a fictional character. And we don't generally think this is kind of weird or strange. I mean, we accept this. We create this kind of arena around fiction and fictional characters where there's nothing seen to be inappropriate about having these very strong emotions. And you go to a cinema and watch a movie, and you can see people getting really worked up, and they're standing up and cheering when some bad character is being killed or something like this, and vice versa. They stand up and weep and cheer when the lovers finally meet and hug each other in the subway, or something. it seems to me this is very similar to what you're describing, isn't it? I mean, we have an area, an emotional life, and it's very important to us. This it's kind of like an imaginary world, and maybe a lot of the things that you're discovering or you're experimenting about is kind of not, well, certainly quite closely related to the world of fiction and the world of reading and to the world in which we relate to fictional characters. Do you think there's anything in that?
I think yes and no. I think that there are a lot of parallels, and in some ways it is very similar, the same. When I was doing some of that empathy research back in the day, so it turns out, and this is just, I think, one theory of empathy, there are probably many, but in psychology, there's this idea that there's cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And the cognitive empathy is kind of, you're intellectually able to take someone's perspective, or you're able to empathize with a fictional character in a book. Like I made my husband watch the movie adaptation of The Remains of the Day in preparation for this, and he moped around the house the whole day afterwards. I don't think it helped with his midlife crisis. So yes, people very much get very wrapped up in fictional characters and stories. But then there's emotional empathy that is a little bit more visceral. So if you become distressed when you see someone in distress and kind of take on their emotions without thinking about it, or this emotional empathy, which is actually the correlation that we found in our experiment was actual emotional empathy that you have for other people. And it's so the thing that has always fascinated me about robots in particular is because they are physical, and in our physical space, they tap into our lizard brains in a way that makes us project life and intent onto them in a way that's less intentional than just losing yourself in a book or a character. So I've wondered if robots actually bring that to a new level that is going to be even more, it's going to be even stronger than what we've felt previously for fictional characters, or for our cars, or for our Furbies. As robots get more advanced, could that make us empathize more with them? Or that the visceral part of it, I think, is really the thing that I'm hoping holds up a mirror to us and is like, hey, what do you actually care about? Because this is just a machine, it doesn't have feelings, and yet you're treating it better than you treat most animals, and maybe even some humans, right? So let's think about this. Let's stop and think about this.
Is it possible that is there an element of people in that situation that you're describing there actually seeing things metaphorically?
I'm sure
they're not responding really. I mean, logically, they're not thinking this, I'm going to hurt this artificial thing. It's got cute eyes and things, but I know that, they made it that way. But without being irrational or over sentimental about it, maybe people, we are metaphoric, we recognize metaphor all the time. And so there's something actually repellent because we see the metaphorical implications. Well, maybe metaphor is a slightly inaccurate word. There's something symbolic. That the creature stands for something, and we realize that if we do something vicious to it, we are endorsing some part of our nature through this kind of symbolism or metaphor. And that we are kind of maybe strengthening that part of our nature that we don't like. I mean, it's here once again. There's the parallel with fiction. I think we disapprove of certain actions happening in fiction because we can actually see a metaphorical relationship or a symbolic relationship with what might happen to us in reality when we go out of that door after we finish reading the book. And so maybe it isn't kind of weird and strange or some kind of out of control kind of sentimentality that's a hangover from and an inability to tell the difference between sentient beings and artificial ones. Maybe there is a whole area of our response that recognizes the importance of metaphor, and that in a kind of very old-fashioned sense, we think it's kind of damaging our soul when we actually do things like that. And in a very real way, it increases the potential for us to do things like that to each other in elsewhere. I mean, is that possible? I mean, does that make any sense to you? That well, we do think in terms of metaphors all the time. I mean, I think this is partly why when you drive a car on the road, I mean, people behave in such weird ways, because I think suddenly driving the road just becomes the kind of metaphor for life and their lives. And
whoa. This is getting deep.
No, I'm interested in the way that I think we're much more metaphorical than we often acknowledge. And this is partly why people like me are allowed to do what people like me do. I get away with all kinds of things. I create emotions on bits of paper.
Well, you get away with it because you're very, very good at it.
Yeah, but I'm very good at, to some extent, provoking that. Well, I wouldn't say the metaphorical instinct in people, but yeah, to some extent, without it, if people are very, very literal minded, none of what I would do would work, because they would say, well, that's all very well. It's got nothing to do with me. I mean, I don't live in that town. I mean, I'm a different height to that character, so it's nothing to do with me. I mean, I think we instinctively see analogies and we see patterns, and we think if that can happen to this little cute robot, it could happen to me, or I could do this to my sister, or something like this. Okay, well, anyway, I'm just speculating.
I wish we could continue this conversation, because yes, and I agree with so much of what you just said. We do need to make a little bit of time for audience questions. And I actually wanted to end with just a couple of rapid fire questions. If you're game for that, you're allowed to skip any you don't want to answer. But the first question is, who is your favorite Beatle?
What you mean, like the Beatles, the musicians, right? Well, you don't know. I mean, you're some kind of scientist. I mean, I don't know. I mean, scientists ask things like that of each other.
You wanted to be a singer-songwriter. Clearly, you must have a favorite Beatle.
Well, look, I have to. It's a terrible thing, but I've never been a huge Beatles fan. I admire them. I think they completely changed British society, maybe the whole world. I think. Some of those melodies are some of the they just last and last in our heads. They seem to come from somewhere else. But I never bought their records or anything. Not my kind of music.
None of the above. Okay, who is Margaret Atwood's favorite Beatle?
Margaret Atwood's favorite Beatle is probably Ringo Starr.
Am
I right?
That's a sick burn. I don't know. I don't know what her favorite Beatle is. I thought you might know.
No, I don't know. I mean, she's a great writer. I wouldn't. I mean, I come across her every now and again. I wouldn't dare ask her something like that. I mean, I'd be too intimidated to ask her something like that. But I thought you knew the answer.
Oh no, I don't. I don't know the answer.
She's kind of surprising. So that's why I went for Ringo Starr, because no one seems to like Ringo. Well, they do. Everyone loves Ringo, but he's never been the favorite. So I thought Margaret Atwood would. Yeah. Okay. So that's my vote. We might find out. Who knows? Okay.
What country are you most relieved to be disassociated with due to Brexit?
Which European country out of the 27?
Yeah.
Well, no, well, I think that kind of almost misunderstands the sorrow I feel about leaving Europe. If we were relating one by one to countries, then there wouldn't be a EU to leave. I mean, for me, the sad, one of the sad things about Europe, it hasn't been I mean, the borders keep changing all the time. You know, it's been a really unstable place. And throughout the 20th century, the borders changed. You know, it doesn't make any sense to say the Czech Republic, or, you know, the Czech Republic was something else. You know, Poland, the borders were somewhere else. You know, and it kept moving. I mean, it was an awful place. For the first half of the 20th century, it was just this kind of a place that produced horror and carnage. And I think it's been a wonderful thing that there is even the, you know, the second half of the 20th century and into this century, we, you know, the Europeans managed to create this kind of borderless, near borderless set of liberal democracies that, you know, living in prosperity and friendship. I mean, this is a turnaround. I think it's a fantastic achievement. It's one of the really great achievements to go from the Second World War to where we were when, you know, this year, last year, and I feel Britain turned its back on that. Yeah, we turned our back on that project. So I feel really sorrowful about that, and I hope it doesn't turn the trend back towards making Europe the way it has been for most of the last few centuries. Yeah. But no particular country, you know. I mean, individual countries, we can still go to them. It's not like we're barred from going to Italy or something like this. I mean,
that was a very beautiful
answer.
That's a great answer to a terrible question, and I'm going to skip the rest of my terrible questions because.
Oh, sorry, was that your question?
That wasn't an audience question. That was my terrible question.
Yeah. Okay. All right,
the audience has much better questions, so okay. we're gonna move to those. Let's see. Oh, Carlos wants to know, what is your favorite book, preferably fiction, of this last hellish year?
That has been. You mean like, Carlos? You mean a book that was published in this last hellish year?
Well, I assume he'll want to buy it. So yeah.
Well, like a lot of people, I haven't actually read a lot of fiction in this hellish year because, you know, my attention has been focused out there, and I've been reading kind of nonfiction and newspaper articles and stuff like that. But and actually, I tell you that the book I loved that I read recently, I'm not even sure if it's out in America. It's Jonathan Coe's Mr. Wilder and Me, which is ostensibly about Billy Wilder, the film director, making his penultimate film, Fedora. But what it really is about kind of European memory and traumatic European memory, coming over to America and trying to make some kind of sense of it, you know, in the American dream factory. And it's about how you carry difficult memories. You know, Wilder himself was an exile from Nazism, and like a lot of those people, filmmakers, you know, they ended up in Hollywood, and they, you know, they try to somehow express themselves through this kind of all the kind of Hollywood genres, and I thought it was a beautiful novel about societal memory, individual memory, about aging. Maybe that's partly why I identify with it. You know, the late part of an artistic career. What do, you know, towards the end? What is late style? What is appropriate for somebody? How do you make the best of things when you're getting older? Are there things that you can take advantage of? Is there something to beautify about that very aging process? I mean, I think a lot of these things are in that book. It's very elegiac. It's Jonathan Coe's Mr. Wilder and Me. As I said, I don't even know if it's published in the States, but I loved it, and it's gone down very well here in the United Kingdom.
Well, let's hope this isn't actually the end of your career. You're only in your 60s, I believe. Many, many more books to come, hopefully. Orly wants to know, oh, I love this. How has the dual identity of a Japanese British informed your thinking about robot-human interaction? From my research, I recognize that Japanese culture is much more comfortable and less alarmed than Western cultures about emotional connections with machines.
That's a really interesting question. Because I haven't really thought about it. I know that, of course, I mean, robotics is kind of much more advanced, if you like, or it's much more prevalent in Japan. But I'm not quite sure if that is just I mean, you'll know more about this, Kate. I mean, is that just a cosmetic thing that you know, you get robots, although, you know, helping you in supermarkets and in hotel lobbies and things in Japan in the way that you don't elsewhere? But is it the case that robots are in fact, I mean, you know, I wouldn't equate robots with AI, you know, and are robots in fact a kind of like a decoy, like a PR decoy for AI?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Are they a
That,
PR
our
decoy? Well,
attention is focused on robots, but the real activity in the AI is happening elsewhere.
I mean, we're certainly way more focused on and fascinated by robots, physical robots moving in our space than AI. And I do agree that a lot of the issues we should be talking about have to do with AI more broadly. And like you mentioned, big data and you know, some of the bigger societal issues have nothing to do with, you know, physical terminators coming to take over. But yeah, I mean, the perception, like on the Japanese American thing, I mean, the perception among most roboticists I know is that Japanese culture is less afraid of having robots around and more accepting of them. And there are a lot of theories as to why that is. Cultural
Japanese
theories.
culture is much more open to toys in general. Yeah, you know, adults have toys. You know, people like to have kind of like stuffed animals. Yeah, and the use of, say, like kind of manga graphics, you know, like sweet little creatures on your clothes and on logos, and you know, you go to Japanese cities and shops and whatever, you're bombarded with kind of these cute cartoon characters everywhere, you know, staring at you from I mean, from walls and things. I mean, I think that, so it's very much part of the texture of Japanese society, is that I mean, you don't just have kind of realistic kind of photographic versions of human beings staring at you from pristine photographs. You know, I think there's always been this thing in Japan of liking to sort of wishing to slightly distort and caricature in a sweet, friendly way the human form. And so maybe that has prepared Japanese society better for, if you like, a kind of like three-dimensional versions of kind of these kind of wacky. I mean, the whole emoji thing is a Japanese thing, you know. I mean, and Pokemon and all those kind of creatures. That's all Japanese culture, and so it's the. I guess I can understand it might be more to do with the general acceptance of these kinds of people or creatures in Japanese life. I don't know. I think that's a really fascinating idea. I mean, but as I say, I'm not quite sure if it goes that deep. You know, I think in itself it's very interesting, particularly around the kind of questions that you're particularly asking. You know, what do robots tell us about human beings and the way they relate to each other? You know. I think it might say something interesting about the Japanese society as opposed to other societies. But and you could equally argue, you know, why are some societies peculiarly resistant to having robots? Why this inhibition about kind of consorting with robots? You know, what's up with robots? You know, why can't you put your arm around a robot? What's wrong with you? You know, I mean, I think that you could ask many questions like that, but yeah, I come back to that central point. I think robots might be a bit of a decoy, and while people equate AI primarily with robots, I'm not saying there's anything devious about the AI industry or something, but I think it's we can have our attention deflected from the big questions about AI. You know, I think. And I think there are big questions about AI. And for me, it's not that robots might take over. That's not it. I mean, I'd be much more concerned about things like massive unemployment, the hard baking in of prejudice into the black boxes of AI, so that we don't understand where the decisions are coming from, but we're unable to unpack the biases and prejudices in the way we've unpacked such things in institutions in the past. And thirdly, I'll be concerned about what the implications are for liberal democracies when AI becomes a very powerful tool for different kinds of societies that are modeled on other things. So I'll be more concerned about those things. But we've kind of rather strayed from that question. I think that's fascinating, but I mean, I don't know enough about Japanese culture to be able to give you, Audie, a good answer on that. Maybe you got some. Do you have?
I thought that was a pretty good answer. Oh, switching gears a little. Okay, from a craft point of view, I'm curious to know how you approached writing the dialogue exposition regarding Klara. Did it feel or move any differently from when you write dialogue exposition of humans? I'm going to guess that's a yes.
No, not really. I mean, to me, I wasn't really aware of Klara being very different to my human narrators in the past. All my narrators had severe restrictions, in their perception. I've always narrated from the point of view of, well, usually I've used this kind of very restricted first person, and it's in the very limitations of the vision of the narrator that I found areas to explore. That's what I find fascinating. The limits to perspective, the narrow vista. I like narrators to be like people who can only see a room through a crack in the door, and they just see little things, moving across this crack, and they have to come to some conclusion from just the little bits that they can see. Which is literally what's kind of happening to Klara at the beginning when she's in the store, and she's just, all she can see of the human world is what she can see out of the window. But in a way, I didn't feel that, even in the craft sense, I didn't feel that narrating from the point of view of Klara was very different from say the butler in The Remains of the Day. In some ways, the butler in The Remains of the Day is technically probably weirder and harder. Klara, I mean, because there aren't loads and loads of artificial, friends out there who could say that you've done it wrong, or you're misrepresenting me. I mean, I feel much freer. Whereas, I mean, you choose a character like an English butler from the first part of the 20th century, you do feel obliged to kind of get some things right. It has to be socially correct, that he would speak like that historically. His behavior would have to be historically accurate. But there's a great liberation about narrating from the point of view of an artificial being, and also a great liberation from the fact that she can be a complete mixture. At one and the same time, she can be like a small child and an incredibly sophisticated, knowledgeable person, coexisting in the same vision. So I don't think for me it wasn't very different. And I come back to this point anyway. I mean, all characters are artificial creatures anyway, because we make them up. So I mean, it's not. I don't think from the point of view of creation, I don't think there's a huge difference.
Makes sense. All right, let me just pick a good, let's see. Thank you for your event tonight, and I love the book. I imagine, this is Keith, I imagine the book was written before the current pandemic, and I wonder how the move towards virtual communication, Zoom, et cetera, has affected both your views toward the future of human interaction and human technology interaction, which you have dealt with so deftly in many novels.
Yeah, well, it was written before the pandemic. So any echoes in that world and the situation we find ourselves in is purely coincidental. Well, at least I think it's coincidental. It may be that some of the things that I've been worrying about at a kind of more general scale includes things like pandemics. I don't know. I mean, but about electronic communication, I don't know. I mean, that's not the thing that has actually been foremost in my mind. Actually, during the pandemic, I have to say, these are fascinating things about, are we going to communicate through video conferencing facilities much more in future? Is it going to do something to our human relationships? Is it possible that some people could actually get married and remain married without ever being in the same physical space? I know these are all quite interesting questions, but in this past year, I have to say, I find it quite hard to actually focus on these undoubtedly interesting questions, because I think I'm staggered by the number of people who have died for a start, and I worry about that. I think the level of death is so high, and at the moment there are millions of people completely shocked and bereaved because they've lost loved ones. We're talking about a scale of losing people that you don't usually come across outside of like major wars. In the United Kingdom, we've reached a death figure that is double the total civilian death of the Second World War. Somebody told me that in your country, the COVID deaths are more than the actual combatant deaths of both World Wars and Vietnam put together. And I think, perhaps understandably, while we're in the middle of this, we don't want to curl up and kind of become too distressed about it. We've got to fight back, and so understandably we're not looking at this. But when we do come out of it, and I hope we do come out of it soon, I think this is something we got to be prepared for. I think the emotional damage that's occurred to people at every level, societal and family level, individual level, I think that we're going to have to deal with this, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to show itself. But in the past, after major wars, when these things have happened, when so many people have been lost, there have been huge changes and huge movements that have occurred as a result. And I think this is one of the things that I think we have to prepare ourselves for. And just at that level, I think we just got to acknowledge the tragedy of it, and it's still happening. And I find it quite difficult to kind of, I'm not criticizing the question, but I just kind of find it hard to think of the situation and think, in terms of things like how would kind of electronic communication change our futures. I mean, I think it's a very interesting question, but I find it very difficult to focus on that one.
On that happy note, no, but I actually think you just did what you do best, which is you took a question about technology and you focused our attention on what is really important. And so I actually think this is a perfect question to end on. And I just wanted to thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I wish we could talk for 5 more hours, but I think we have to wrap up now. And I don't know if anyone from the bookstore is coming back on screen. Lauren?
Here I am.
We're alone. Oh, sorry.
Hi. Oh, I just want to thank you both for that absolutely incredible conversation. I'm going to have a lot to think about after this. I'm sure all of our viewers will too. Thank you to everyone out there for watching. Thanks for all of your fantastic questions. I'm sorry we didn't have, like Kate said, 5 more hours to get to them. But I just thank you again. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and Politics and Prose, have a good night and keep reading, and please be well. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.